You think your backyard is private? You think it's safe? Think again. I grew up with a backyard that felt like its own small country. Summers were a map of rituals. The barbecue grill on the corner of the patio, a row of rickety lawn chairs, the garage where old bicycles slept. For most people, that space is just grass between house and fence. For me, it became the setting of things I still, years later, can't quite explain. These are 3 true stories, all different nights, different ages, but the same theme. A familiar yard turning into something that watches, waits, or walks into your life. I was the one who lived these moments. I'm the same person telling them now. They're not linked by a single suspect or by neat outcomes. They're linked by the feeling that a place you leave the back door unlocked for could at some point be used against you. If you love true horror, hit subscribe and stay for all 3 stories. Story 1. The Tent and the Eye. When I was 7, my older brother Scott was everything I wanted to be. He had a square jaw that could hide a dare, a pocket full of promises, and a knack for being chosen for sleepovers and scout camps. I was the middle child, small, a little clingy, always asking to come along. My parents tried to make up for the missed trips by staging backyard adventures. They'd let Scott and me sleep out in the yard sometimes, a patchwork of sleeping bags under the maple tree with a cheap nylon tent set up by the fire pit. The tent was my kingdom, or it should have been. Scott took the outside berth, where he could boast about hearing cars and planes first. I got the middle. We brought Game Boys. We ate cold pizza and argued about which ghost stories were real. The crickets stitched the night together. My mother made us a thermos of hot cocoa and tucked a thin blanket over our shoulders. The stars felt like the sky's version of a porch light. At some point after midnight, the tent hummed with the soft, consistent sound of sleeping breath. My Game Boy's screen was dark. Scott's snore was a dim, proud constellation. I woke because the tent felt different, airier, as if someone had unzipped a part of it. In that split second, the world was a squeak away from being ordinary. I sat up, and through the little gap where the tent overlapped, an eye stared in. Not a full face, not a whisper. An eye, round and still, peering through the tiny opening just above my sleeping bag. It looked like it belonged to a grown man. The skin around it was rough from the weather, I think, or at least that's how I remember it. The memory runs on texture more than on facts. The eye blinked once. That single blink froze every blood vessel in my body. I remember thinking, eyes were not supposed to be in the dark at my level. I screamed. The scream was a raw animal sound. It tore the night in two. Someone shouted my name, my father, stumbling out with a flashlight that cut the yard in a narrow white line. The light chased the shadow, and the flash made the eye retreat like a thing pulled back into a crack. When my father pushed open the tent, there was no one there. No footprints in the soft dirt around the fire pit. No cigarette butt. Just the cinch of the zipper, still warm from whatever had grazed it, and our half-burned marshmallows. The police came. My parents wrapped me in a bathrobe and sat on the kitchen steps while officers lifted flashlights like questions. They took my statement. They asked about neighbors. They looked at the fence line and said the gate latch was closed. Not locked, but closed. They radioed back and forth. Nothing was found. I was 7. The officers were adult voices that tried to reassure and sounded like they were reading from a script. Someone could have been curious, one said, or maybe a neighbor walking a dog. That line placed the event into normalcy, but it didn't erase the image. For weeks afterwards, I was a different kind of small. I would not sleep without the hallway light on. I checked every zipper before falling asleep. If the family dog wandered into the yard, I watched it like it was a rescuer. In daylight, I learned to calibrate fear with proof. A man walked down the street was a man. At night, a shadow could be anything. Then, a month later, I was at the schoolyard fence after class, just killing time, pretending to be taller than my sneakers made me, when a man walked up the path on the other side. He was a stranger in a brown jacket and a tired hat. He didn't speak to anyone else. He walked along the fence like someone inspecting the perimeter of a house. When he reached where I stood, he stopped and said, casually, "You don't remember me, do you?" My mouth went dry. His voice was ordinary, like he might have been asking for the time. I felt my 7-year-old self in a loop of film, hearing the question and remembering the eye. I backed away without answering. He kept watching me, then turned and left. I later told my parents and they called the police. The officers wrote it down. That was it. No charges. No one available to identify him. I thought it might have been nothing. Maybe a neighbor. Maybe a coincidence. But the way he'd said it, like he expected me to remember him, pressed into a place inside that didn't yet know fear. The event became a grammar that shaped how I thought of space. A tent pitched in a backyard was supposed to be play. Instead, I learned that the thin weave of nylon was just another layer that could be pierced by an eye. Years later, I would still catch myself checking zippers twice before tucking in, even when the stakes were now my own. The image that won't leave, the blink, the sudden flash of a human eye in the seam of nylon, the sense of being small and observed. Story 2. The House with Smiling Windows. Years later I was older, restless, and comfortable enough to trust my instincts a little more. I was buying furniture through Marketplace, old wood and good stories. There are bargains in those listings that feel like petitioning strangers for grace. The ad said coastal house, oak dining table, excellent condition. The photos were aspirational. A white porch, an impressive set of windows facing the ocean, a sweep of landscaped lawn. The house looked like a postcard someone had left in the sun too long. I drove down a dirt tree-lined road that wound toward a bluff. The car ate the gravel, and my breath got quiet. Off the road sat the house in the photos, bigger than it seemed online. There was an older sedan parked by the driveway. A note taped to the front door read, "Doorbell broken, please knock." The porch light was off. The blinds on the huge front windows were drawn so tightly, the house looked like it was holding its breath. I stayed in my car for a bit, scrolling through the listing again to check details. The yard was immaculate in daylight, manicured hedges, statuesque hydrangeas. There was a small path that led to a cliffside lookout, where you could see the ocean churn. I told myself I'd take a picture from there of the potential furniture, because sometimes sellers want you to see the item in context. I walked up the path, the ocean wind sowing my hair behind my ears, and took a few shots. When I came back, the house had changed. At first, it was small. A single blind was raised in the upstairs window. Then another, like a curtain breath. And then a wall of faces leaned into view, all at once, behind the glass. They were arranged like photographs. Heads tilted, smiles perfectly still. Some looked like mannequins. Some looked human. Their smiles were deliberate, practiced, like people posing for a group portrait. They didn't move. They didn't lean in to see me. They just existed in that row of windows, perfectly composed. That was the moment my hair walked the back of my neck. The natural reaction is to think of mannequins, or a party, or staged art. But these faces felt like an audience appearing to check a performance was proceeding on cue. One of them, someone on the porch maybe, moved. A figure stood and looked right at me through the front glass. I could taste metallic fear. I said hello out loud. The word left my mouth like a test balloon. The figure blinked but didn't wave. I felt conspicuously exposed, like a character realizing he'd stumbled into the middle of a ritual. I started to walk away, trying not to show my anxiety. From the porch, someone watched me move toward my car. The sedan remained. The note on the front door was still there. It looked deliberate in a way I couldn't place. I called Tom, my neighbor from down the street. Practical, calm Tom, who knew how to handle people without making them feel small. He called the homeowner, whose name was Jim. Tom came out himself. He walked up the driveway, did a careful look, and came back shaking his head. "Jim's supposed to be away," he said. "This house was supposed to be empty for a week." Tom's voice was low, not quite alarmed, more like someone cataloging an awkward fact. We called the number on the listing again. The profile I'd messaged was gone by the time I checked. The photos vanished like someone had scrubbed a page from the internet. I remember now that it felt like being uninvited from something I hadn't been invited to in the first place. Tom asked if we should call the police. We did. Officers came out and checked the locks. The front door was unlocked. One of the back doors, the one opening toward the yard, was slightly ajar. Nothing in the house seemed to be stolen. It was as if someone had staged the scene for the purpose of spectacle and had left nothing behind. What stayed with me was the idea that they wanted me to see the faces from the street, and perhaps to turn and walk toward the open backyard where the house faced the cliff. Why would anyone want strangers to come just to stand in the lawn and look at their windows? What game was running? Were those faces real people, mannequins, photos mounted in frames? The officers shrugged. They wrote down what I told them. There was no reportable theft, no sign of forced entry, just an unlocked door and a profile that had disappeared like a person who refuses to be found. I left with an uneasy certainty that the yard had been the lure. The beachside lawn, a place usually associated with barbecues and late summer drinks, had been curiously curated to make a passerby stop and look inward. When I drove away, the sedan followed the thickness of my rearview mirror for a moment before it turned down a road that folded into the same trees. I remember sliding my car door shut like a person pulling the blinds down on the world. Story 3. The Pool and the Wet Footsteps. The last story is the one I replay more than any of the others because its stakes were immediate and the choices were tiny. I was hosting a backyard pool party while my parents were out of town. It was summer. We had string lights and a speaker that kept getting closer to feedback the more people swayed on the patio. Friends were sprawled on towels. Someone tracked mud across the deck, and nobody cared because the beer cooler was open, and someone else had brought corn on the grill. The woods behind our property always made a soft border, a place for teenagers to whisper and hide cigarettes. I'd heard a cough from those trees earlier in the day, nothing more than a note of irritation, but it lodged in my head later as something less innocent. People left in a slow departure. Some stayed overnight. The speakers quieted. At about 2 a.m, a murmur ran through the house, a sound I folded into the night and labeled sleep. Then a loud splash cut through the air, abrupt and public. A body of water being disturbed at that hour is the same as a shout. I grabbed a towel and went out to the deck. The pool lights painted the water a bright, nervous blue. There was a man in the shallow end, alone. He swam like someone who had earned his right to be there. He climbed out, dripping, and walked across the deck toward the sliding glass door that led into my house. The sliding door was closed, but not locked. I remember him in sections, water falling from his hair, the dark of his shirt clinging to his chest, the way his shoes left a staccato trail of wet footprints on the deck as he approached. My heart performed quick, panicked math. I could imagine waking up to a stranger in the kitchen, and that picture made everything immediate. I ran to the bedroom, threw my door shut, and twisted the bolt that had been part of my defensive training since the tent. I called 911 and told them there was someone in the pool. My voice was steadier after the bolt clicked into place. The man pounded first at the glass, slow rhythmic taps. Then he started to shout, "It's me! Open the door!" Every syllable unstitched something inside of me. The voice was casual, in a way meant to gut me, like he could be a friend who'd been away for dinner and was teasing me for being dramatic. It was a voice that tried to be ordinary and wielded ordinariness as a weapon. I told him loudly that the police were on their way. He stopped at that. There was a long moment where only the sound of water stitched the yard together. Then the man turned and walked away. When the officers arrived, they followed a wet track from the pool, across the deck, up the back steps past the framed photos we had propped against the wall, and up the staircase to my locked bedroom door. They found the prints ending in the exact spot where I had bolted the deadbolt. They cleared the rest of the house. There was no one else, no forced entry, no sign of what he'd been looking for. He had moved carefully, almost with an economy of motion. Arrive, swim, come to the door, try a line, then leave. I later thought he might have been testing the door, testing how our house answered to noises, to knocks, to the idea of someone home. My hands still remember the weight of that bolt. At the time, I kept thinking in parentheses, if I hadn't been late to bed, had been in the kitchen, had gone to answer because I thought it was a friend, how different would the night have been? Small decisions kept me safe. The party had been noisy enough that if I'd gone outside without locking the door and calling out, I might have been welcoming a stranger into the house. There was gratitude that night layered on fear. Afterwards, I talked to my friend Mark about it, and he said something I've carried with me. People test fences before they climb them. He didn't mean physically scale the wood. He meant they test the ways we live, how we answer the door, how quickly we check on noises, whether we trust our own instincts. The police logged the call. They took photographs of the wet footprints. They gave me the boilerplate advice about locks, about neighbors watching for each other. Practical things, yes, but unsatisfying because no motive was found. No one was arrested. The woods behind the house remained a possibility, a place where a cough could mean a test for an opening, or simply a hunter of summer moths. The sequence of real, small choices, closing a door, swapping the porch light on, felt like the difference between an ordinary night and something that might have turned monstrous. The shiver that binds them. These three stories are separated by years and by a lot of calendar pages. They are linked by a thread that runs through them. The backyard as a threshold. The tent, the manicured lawn by the cliffside, the pool deck, they're all ordinary. They're places your neighbors know, spaces you don't guard like a bank vault, because you live there. And that ordinariness is what makes them vulnerable. There's another motif that threads them together. The face that watches. An eye at a tent zipper. A wall of smiling faces in a window. Wet footprints leading up the stairs to your bedroom door. The same act of being observed from the outside until you notice you're not alone. In the tent, the eye was a fragment that suggested more. In the house with the smiling windows, the faces were a conscious display. In the pool story, the intruder used the openness of water and darkness to move himself closer. In every case, the line between public and private, the place where yard meets porch, where grass meets glass, was negotiated without the occupant's consent. None of these stories end with a neat resolution. That is the point. You don't always get answers. You don't always get someone to say exactly why they were at your doorstep or in your yard. Sometimes you're left with an image that sits in your ribcage. Sometimes you're left with a question you ask yourself at 2 in the morning when the house is quiet. What if I had done something different? I don't tell these stories to make you paranoid. I tell them because they're a record of how fragile the bubble of home can be. They're a record of how small, mundane choices, closing a zipper, keeping a door bolted, picking up the phone, matter when the line between safe and unsafe is as thin as a blade of grass. What haunts me the most is the unresolved possibility in each memory. The man at the tent might have chosen any one of us. The faces in the windows might have been waiting for the right person to come where the yard was open. The man at my pool might have been checking how we answered to noise. They were moments that could have pivoted into violence but didn't, and we can't always know why. I wind those images around me on nights when the wind is doing something clever with branches, when the streetlight throws a weird rectangle through my blinds and I stare back into it. I keep thinking about the small, decisive things that saved me. Screaming, a parent coming in time, locking a door, a car in the driveway that made me suspicious. I'm not suggesting that anyone can guarantee their safety. What I'm saying is that vigilance is a muscle you can exercise, and sometimes it will pay off in ways that feel like miracles, and other times it will feel useless. Before I go, let these 3 images sit with you for a moment. The single human eye at the seam of a tent, blinking into a child's sleep. An entire facade of unmoving smiles behind glass. Wet footprints climbing the stairs toward a sleeping person's door. They're small visuals, tight, precise, but they have a kind of staying power that memory polishes into a tool. If these gave you chills, like the video, subscribe, and tell me in the comments if your backyard has a secret. Be safe out there. And remember, the space between your back door and your fence is quieter than you think, and sometimes that silence is listening.